Of all the mysteries surrounding the making of gear, none draws more attention than the issue of stitch length. What stitch length is best for the project at hand seems to be a universal quandary. To top it off, there is little information in the books available. The Complete Book of Sewing, a practical guide to sewing techniques, offers no advice whatsoever concerning which number to set that adjustment at. Grizzly Adams, an active member on hammockforums.net, has applied his mathematics background to many DIY projects on the forum. His insight has provided some very important criteria for the success of hammock suspensions. I invited Grizz to turn his attention to optimum stitch length for any given piece of fabric. Here's what he had to say.
The problem of choosing the optimal number of stitches per inch is a simple multi-objective optimization problem with linear constraints that can be easily solved using standard methods. Plotting the shearing force against the stitch density, we can, for all practical purposes, plot the shearing strength of the fabric as a constant line. Against this plot, the breaking strength of the thread is a function of stitch density, which of course is a natural linear function. Density has a limit though, because with too high density the fabric will simply tear, so we put in a constraint. The space of feasible solutions is trivially convex, and if the objective function were linear, we could simply use the simplex method for solution. It might not be linear, but it is reasonable to assume that the projection of the utility function on a fixed density is convex, which would imply that if the function is likewise globally differentiable, then a straightforward optimization algorithm like Newton-Raphson will be perfectly adequate.
Thanks, Grizz. That was helpful. The standard length for hand-sewn straight stitch is referenced as 3 millimeters, or 8 to 9 stitches per inch. That would make sense, then, that a sewing machine would use a 3 millimeter stitch as a standard length as well. But things are not that simple. Heavy fabrics can handle a longer stitch without a problem. Very lightweight, thin fabrics need a shorter stitch in order to seam without gaps between the stitches. Short stitches form a strong seam for high stress conditions, but short stitches take longer to sew than long stitches. Long stitches go through the machine faster and are used for lower stress seams and for temporary stitch lines known as basting. Short stitches make it much easier to navigate curves and give a smoother line than longer lengths. In essence, at least on woven fabric, there's no such thing as the optimal stitch length. Behind this mystery is the very concrete, pragmatic base of what works best for you. All the more reason for working with samples before you start a major and important project. Which needle should I use? Yet another mystery lurking to ambush the beginning gear maker. Needles come in different types for different purposes. Thickness is one of the most obvious choices. Fine needles are typically 70 or 9. Medium are termed 90 or 14. Heavy needles list as 110 or 18. There are also gauges in between those. Please be aware that different manufacturers may rate the gauge of their needles differently, but they're all roughly the same. The fabric weight and density will determine which one of the needles that you use. Needles have different points. Sharp points are the most common in terms of gear making, but ball points work best on knits, jersey, and fleece fabrics. Heavy pack cloth would probably require a denim or jean point needle, and leather has a needle all of its own, which should not be used for any woven fabric. The leather needle has a knife edge and will cut the fabrics, weakening the fabric at each stitch. How do I put this thing together? What seams should I use and where? Once again, there is quite a bit of choice that goes into this decision. You've already been introduced to the French seam. This seam is very useful on lightweight and flexible fabrics in loose-fitting applications. You probably would not want to make a compression sack with a French seam, even out of sil nylon, because of the stresses involved on the seam. However, a ditty bag would be fine and would remain crushable and soft. There are a variety of seams which fall into the category of folded seams. In these seams, multiple layers of fabric are folded over each other and are held by multiple lines of stitching. The layers of fabric make these seams useful for all fabrics, but particularly for mid and heavyweight types. They can make very strong seams and can handle a lot of stress. The simplest and most basic seam is the open seam. Here there is just one stitch line holding the fabric. It uses the smallest seam allowance, but is subject to fraying, so the raw edges need to be finished in an alternate way. Heat sealing, binding, or zigzag finishing are the most common for the gear maker. Seam allowances are one of those overlooked issues, particularly when designing your own patterns, as many gear makers do. All too often I have laid out the piece I wanted to make, only to realize after cutting the fabric that I did not allow for the seams. The industry standard for commercial garment patterns is 5/8 of an inch. But when you are doing your own patterns, you can allow for whatever you want. Different seams can have different seam allowances. Know how you construct the seam and make sure you have enough extra fabric to do it. Sometimes it's helpful to cut a seam apart and actually measure the amount of seam allowance you need. Seam allowances have to be included in the measurements for the pattern. The amount extra needs to be added everywhere there is a stitch line. It is helpful to be consistent within the pattern, but not essential. It's a good idea to note somewhere on the pattern how much seam allowance has been provided. The last mystery we'll discuss here is fabric and thread. Fabric is simple. It's your choice. Plain and simple. There are no hard and fast rules. Safety needs to be considered, of course, but that also depends on what level of risk you are willing to accept. There is usually a trade-off between gear weight and durability and cost. But ultimately, the nice thing about making your own gear is you are in control of those decisions. Thread is also a fairly straightforward choice. Use a good quality 100% polyester thread for finished products. It is best if the thread has been treated to be UV resistant. Cheap thread will pill more in the machine and is more subject to abrasion in the field. Blended threads will tend to rot under adverse weather exposure. For samples and trial pieces, any thread can be used.